This 1897 portrait shows a mother and daughter smiling. Zoom into their eyes, and the smile disappears completely. The basement of the Boston Historical Society smelled of old paper and forgotten time. Laura Bennett had worked there 3 years, cataloging donations that arrived in cardboard boxes and dusty crates, each one a small portal into the past. On a cold February morning in 2024, she opened a box labeled simply, "Estate Sale." Beacon Hill Miscellaneous Photographs. Beneath layers of yellowed tissue paper, she found dozens of photographs from the late 19th century. Most were the usual fair, stiff-backed gentlemen with impressive mustaches, children in their Sunday best, families posed on front porches. She'd seen thousands like them. Then her hand landed on one that made her stop. A professional studio portrait, the kind wealthy families commissioned in the 1890s. The photographer's mark in the corner read, "Whitmore & Sons Studio, Boston, 1897. 2 figures filled the frame, a woman in her early 30s in an elaborate dark dress with a high collar and ornate buttons, and a girl of 7 or 8 in white lace with ribbons in her carefully curled hair, seated on her mother's lap in a velvet chair, both posed in the formal Victorian style. Everything about it spoke of money and respectability. Painted columns in the backdrop, expensive fabric, perfect posture. In every technical sense, a beautiful portrait of a refined Boston family. But something was wrong. Laura tilted the photograph toward the light. Mother and daughter were smiling, or rather, their mouths were arranged into the shape photographers of that era demanded. Their eyes told an entirely different story. The mother's eyes were too wide, fixed, carrying something closer to barely controlled panic than serenity, a tension across her face that fought against the gentle curve of her mouth. And the little girl's eyes held pure, silent terror, her small hands gripping her mother's arm hard enough that her fingers had gone white against the dark fabric. Laura knew Victorian photography conventions well, the long exposures that forced stillness, the general discomfort people felt before a camera, the way even happy families often looked stern simply because holding a smile for the shutter was harder than it looked. She'd learned to read past all of that, the way an art conservator learns to see brushstrokes instead of just a painting. This wasn't stiffness, and it wasn't discomfort. This was fear, captured and held for over a century, hiding in plain sight behind 2 carefully arranged mouths. She turned the photograph over. In faded pencil, Elizabeth and Clara, March 1897. May God forgive us. Her pulse quickened. She photographed every detail at high resolution, opened her laptop, and began searching the Historical Society's archives for any record of an Elizabeth and Clara in 1897 Boston. The investigation had begun. The names alone led nowhere too common, no surname. But the studio mark did. Laura tracked down Whitmore & Sons, which had operated on Tremont Street from 1889 to 1902, serving Boston's wealthy elite. The clothing told her more, the mother's leg of mutton sleeves, the daughter's impractical white dress requiring servants to maintain. This wasn't a middle-class family. This was Beacon Hill, or Back Bay money. She turned to the Boston Globe's digitized archives, scrolling through the social columns for 1897 charity events, dinner parties, arrivals and departures, page after page of the small, self-important rituals of upper-class Boston life. Her eyes ached against the old typeface by the time she reached March. In the March 15th edition, buried on page 7, she found it. Mrs. Elizabeth Ashworth and daughter Clara have departed the city for an extended rest. Mrs. Ashworth's health has been delicate of late, and the family seeks the restorative benefits of country air. Ashworth, a name, finally. William Ashworth turned out to be a banker with a residence on Mount Vernon Street. In the heart of Beacon Hill, a man who sat on the boards of charitable organizations and moved comfortably through Boston's financial elite. But after that brief March notice, Elizabeth vanished from the society pages entirely. William kept appearing bank meetings, clubs, charitable dinners, always alone. No wife, no daughter, ever mentioned again. Laura wrote it out on a notepad, a portrait capturing clear distress, A wife's health described in the vague Victorian language that could mean anything from illness to something engineered. And then silence. She needed to know what happened to Elizabeth and Clara Ashworth after March 1897. And she needed to know who had written "May God forgive us" on the back of their photograph, and why. The Massachusetts State Archives in Dorchester felt worlds away from her dusty basement, climate-controlled, modern, quiet. The archivist, a man named Robert, studied her request with interest. "The Ashworth family," he said. "Haven't heard that name in years. What's your angle?" Laura showed him the photograph. His expression sobered as he took in the fear in their eyes. Victorian Boston had ways of making inconvenient women disappear, he said quietly, and went to pull what the archive had. Death records from 1897 turned up nothing. No Elizabeth, no Clara. Relief, and then dread. If they hadn't died, they'd gone somewhere else. Laura moved to asylum admissions, McLean Hospital in Belmont, the Boston Lunatic Hospital, Taunton State Hospital, institutions where wealthy families could quietly commit relatives who'd become inconvenient. The admission ledgers were fragile, some pages water-stained or missing entirely, and she worked through them by hand. One entry at a time, aware that a single skipped page could mean missing the one line that mattered. In the McLean ledger for April 1897, she found it. Elizabeth Ashworth, age 32. Admitted April 12, 1897, committed by husband, William Ashworth. Diagnosis, hysteria and melancholia. Patient displays agitation and makes unfounded accusations against family members. Hysteria, the catch-all Victorian doctors used to dismiss whatever a woman was trying to say. Unfounded accusations. What had Elizabeth tried to tell someone? The ledger gave no discharge date, no transfer, nothing. Elizabeth simply stopped being mentioned after June. And Clara? Laura's stomach tightened as she turned to the records of the Boston Female Asylum, an institution for orphaned and dependent children. Clara Ashworth, age 7. Admitted March 20, 1897. Father unable to care for child due to mother's illness. Child is quiet and compliant, but suffers from nightmares. March 20th, days after the photograph was taken, weeks before Elizabeth was even committed. William Ashworth had separated them almost immediately. The picture wasn't a family portrait at all, Laura realized. It was evidence. Elizabeth had known what was coming, and she'd made a record of it, a silent testimony in silver and paper, left for someone, someday, to find. The next 2 days took Laura through Suffolk County property and court records, tracing William Ashworth's finances. In 1893, he'd inherited his father's banking firm and the Mount Vernon Street mansion, a prosperous business serving some of Boston's wealthiest families, the kind of institution built as much on reputation as on money. But in early 1897, just weeks before the photograph, several major clients had quietly withdrawn their accounts, one after another, with no public explanation. A February 1897 item in the Boston Herald noted vague concerns about management practices at Ashworth & Company. William declined to comment, and the paper, notably, didn't push further. Then, Laura found the court filing. In June 1897, 2 months after Elizabeth's commitment, 3 former clients sued William for misappropriation of funds. The case was settled quietly, the records sealed by agreement of all parties, a resolution only money and connections could buy. The pattern snapped into focus. William had been embezzling from his clients. Elizabeth had found out, and when she threatened to expose him, he'd used the full weight of Victorian law against her, a husband's near absolute power to commit his wife without proof, control her property, and cut off her children. Society, especially Boston society, would simply assume the woman was unwell. A transfer record in McLean's own files, dated July 15, 1897, confirmed the next step. Elizabeth Ashworth transferred to Taunton State Hospital. Patient remains agitated and resistant to treatment. Prognosis poor. Taunton had a reputation even worse than McLean's: overcrowded, underfunded, a place where inconvenient people simply disappeared into the record books. William hadn't just silenced Elizabeth. He'd made sure no one from her old life would ever think to look for her there. Clara's file at the Boston Female Asylum, preserved at the Massachusetts Historical Society, was thin, but devastating. The matron's handwritten notes tracked a 7-year-old's slow unraveling. March 25th, Clara remains withdrawn, does not play with the other children, calls for her mother at night. April 10th, nightmares persist. She wakes screaming and cannot be consoled. The doctor recommends a sedative tonic. May 15th, Clara asked again when her mother will come for her. I told her to pray and be patient. Then, in September, something changed. Received inquiry from Mrs. Sarah Cunningham regarding Clara Ashworth. Mrs. Cunningham claims to be the child's maternal aunt. Sarah Cunningham's letters followed, elegant, increasingly urgent. She'd only just learned of her sister's situation, she wrote, and wanted to see Clara, to offer her a home in Cambridge. The asylum deferred to William. Sarah pressed harder. I have attempted to contact Mr. Ashworth multiple times without success. Elizabeth would want me to ensure Clara's well-being. By late October, William's answer arrived by way of his secretary. Miss Sarah Cunningham is not to be granted access to my daughter. She is a spinster of unstable temperament who has filled my wife's head with unreasonable ideas. Any further interference will be met with legal action. After that, Sarah vanished from Clara's file, but Laura now had a name to follow and an address: 47 Brattle Street, Cambridge. Occupation: teacher. A woman with her own income and her own household, independent enough to challenge a man like William Ashworth, and threatened into silence for trying. Laura brought the case to a colleague, Dr. Marcus Green, a historian of Victorian social institutions. Reading through the documents at a Harvard Square coffee shop, his expression darkened. This is devastating, he said, but not uncommon. The law was built to protect men like Ashworth, not the women who married them. He tapped Sarah's letters. This aunt was brave, though. Genuinely brave. Challenging a man of his standing could have ended her career, and it sounds like it did. It had. Cambridge records showed Sarah had taught at the Agassiz School on Sacramento Street from 1890 until November 1897, when her employment ended, abruptly resigned for personal reasons, the school board minutes noted, with no further explanation. The kind of careful phrasing institutions used when they wanted a problem to disappear quietly. But Marcus found something better. A collection of Sarah's personal papers, donated to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe by her grandniece in 1975, diaries, correspondence, teaching materials, sealed in boxes for decades and never fully catalogued. Her 1897 diary, in tiny, precise handwriting, documented a woman fighting a battle she had almost no power to win. August 15th, I have finally learned where Elizabeth is. McLean, then transferred to Taunton, a terrible place. I have written to her but received no reply. I fear the letters are intercepted. September 2nd, William would not admit me to the house. His secretary says I am not to interfere in family matters. Family matters, as if imprisoning a wife and abandoning a child is a private concern. September 20th, I have retained a lawyer. He says William holds complete legal authority over both of them, and unless we can prove he's unfit, the courts won't intervene. October 10th, I visited Clara today, thin, sad, dark circles under her eyes, asking about her mother constantly. She pressed something into my hand when the matron wasn't looking, a drawing of a house with bars on the windows. This is where Mama is, she whispered. Laura had to stop reading for a moment. Somehow, despite every wall William had built between them, a 7-year-old had known. The final entry, November 8th, my lawyer says our legal options are exhausted. Society will not condemn a wealthy banker on a woman's word, but I cannot abandon them to this. Tomorrow I travel to Taunton. I will see my sister, and I will find a way to help her, whatever it costs me. The diary stopped there. The following pages had been torn out. At the bottom of the last box, Marcus found a sealed envelope, private, not to be opened, until after my death. Inside was an unsigned letter, dated December 1897, as if Sarah had been too frightened to claim it even in her own private papers. I went to Taunton on November 9th. The building was a nightmare, overcrowded wards, the smell and the sound of despair everywhere. I claimed to be Elizabeth's sister and threatened to write to every newspaper in Boston if they refused me. They brought her to a small room. I barely recognized her, thin, her hair roughly cut, in a stained institutional dress. But her eyes were still sharp. She was not mad. She had never been mad. She told me everything, quickly, as if she feared we'd be interrupted. William had been stealing from his clients for years, falsified records, invented investments. She'd found the proof by accident in February, hidden in his study. When she confronted him and said she'd go to the authorities, he laughed and told her no one would believe a woman over her own husband. Then, he acted Clara to the orphanage first, under cover of Elizabeth's illness, and 2 doctors who owed him money to sign the commitment papers. When she kept insisting on her sanity and demanding a lawyer, he had her moved to Taunton, where her voice would be lost among hundreds of others. She begged me to take Clara, told me William's temper was violent, that Clara had witnessed things no child should see, that this was why they'd looked so frightened in the photograph. They'd gone to the studio the very day William learned she'd been asking questions about his business. The portrait was her insurance evidence, in case anyone ever thought to look. Before I could answer, the attendants took her away. She called back to me. "Save Clara. The photograph. Make someone see." When I returned home, William's lawyer was waiting with papers accusing me of defamation, threatening my position at the school. If I continued, I would be prosecuted. I have no money for a long legal fight, no husband, no father to lend my word any weight. I am simply a spinster schoolteacher making wild accusations against a respected banker. Society will destroy me before it questions him. The letter ended there. She gave up, Marcus said quietly. She had no choice. Clara remained at the Boston Female Asylum until 1900, when she turned 10, discharged to father's custody. The ledger noted simply. The 1900 census showed her back at Mount Vernon Street, one dependent in a household with no servants listed, unusual for a family of that wealth. By 1910, at 20, she was still there. Occupation listed as none, her father's housekeeper in every way but title. In 1912, Clara married a clerk named James Whitfield and moved to Dorchester. She had gotten out. Elizabeth's file at Taunton, retrieved with help from the museum archivist there, was thicker than Laura expected, and worse. The notes described her as agitated and delusional, for insisting she wasn't ill, for demanding a lawyer, for maintaining that her husband had committed fraud. The treatments, cold baths, isolation, sedatives, were punishment dressed as medicine. For months she held on. Patient continues to be articulate and organized in her thinking, though content remains delusional. Coherent and rational, in other words, and disbelieved anyway, month after month, by doctors who had already decided what her sanity would cost them to admit. Then, January 1898, patient has grown increasingly despondent. She no longer speaks of her previous accusations. Dr. Hammond believes the reality of her situation has finally begun to break through her defensive delusions. She hadn't been cured of a delusion. She'd been broken by 11 years of exactly this. Elizabeth Ashworth died at Taunton on March 3, 1909, age 44. Cause of death: pneumonia. The real cause, Laura knew, was a system that let a husband erase his wife, and a society that never thought to ask questions. Back in Boston, Laura traced what remained of Clara's life. The Dorchester Trail went cold after 1918, until a Boston Globe obituary from January 1952 turned up. Clara Whitfield, 62, died at her home in Quincy, survived by her husband, James Whitfield, and daughter Eleanor. Mrs. Whitfield was known for her volunteer work with the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Clara had spent her adult life protecting children. Laura found her volunteer file at the Boston Children's Services Archive: home visit reports, court testimony, letters written on behalf of kids no one else was fighting for. 1. From 1935, addressed to a judge. I know from personal experience how easily a child can be separated from a loving parent and labeled as troublesome when the real problem lies with those in power. Children cannot defend themselves against adult authority. The law must protect them, especially when their own parents will not. She had never forgotten. Following Eleanor's line forward, Marcus found a granddaughter, Margaret, born 1941, now 83, and living at a retirement community in Newton. Laura called. My grandmother never spoke about her childhood, Margaret said, her voice clear and steady. She'd become upset if we asked. We just knew her mother died young. A pause. What have you found? Please come tomorrow, Margaret said, before Laura had even finished asking to visit. Margaret met her in a sunny room, 83 years old, sharp-eyed, sitting with her grandmother's same straight posture. Her son Daniel and granddaughter Emma had driven in once she'd called them, both of them curious and a little wary, the way families get when a stranger claims to know something about them they don't know themselves. Laura laid out the photograph first and watched 3 generations look, for the first time, into the terrified faces of women who belonged to them. My God, Margaret whispered. She was so young, so afraid. She kept her fingers hovering just above the glass, as if she wanted to touch it, and didn't quite dare. Laura told them everything: the embezzlement, the asylum, Sarah Cunningham's letters, the 11 years at Taunton. Your great-grandmother knew she was going to be silenced, she said, so she made evidence instead. This photograph, she was hoping someone, someday, would understand what it meant. Margaret cried quietly. She never told us. Not a word. She carried all of it alone. But she did something with it, Emma said, pulling the volunteer letters closer. Look, she spent her whole life protecting other children. She made sure other kids didn't go through what she went through. Your grandmother was remarkable, Laura said. So was your great-grandmother. Before she left, Emma asked the question sitting under all of it. What happened to William Ashworth? Did he ever face any consequences? He hadn't. He died in 1915, wealthy and respected, buried under a large monument at Mount Auburn Cemetery, his obituary calling him a pillar of Boston society, no mention of a wife or a daughter. That's not right, Daniel said quietly. No, Laura agreed. But we can change the story now. Laura spent the following months, with the Chen family's blessing, writing the fullest account she could, publishing in the Journal of Women's History, then helping the Historical Society build an exhibition around the restored photograph. She insisted the exhibit include both versions, damaged and restored, side by side, so visitors could see exactly what a century of neglect had almost erased for good. Visitors came to stand in front of it and saw, this time, not just the fear in 2 faces, but the determination behind it, a mother who'd known she was about to be erased, and had made sure she couldn't be. Margaret attended the opening with her whole family, standing a long time in front of the portrait of her grandmother as a frightened 7-year-old. We see you now, she said quietly. Both of you. We see you, and we remember, and we honor what it cost you. The photograph had waited 127 years for someone to look closely enough to ask the right question. Laura thought, watching visitors move slowly past the case, about how many other portraits in how many other archives might be holding the same kind of silence, a fixed smile, over something the sitter never got to say out loud, waiting, the way Elizabeth and Clara had waited, for someone to finally zoom in.